Let me see. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to LTV Talks. Today we have Sundar Swaminathan with us. I'm probably the only person who can get his name pronounced correctly in Western Europe. But yeah, Sundar is a seriously good writer and he shares insightful thoughts on B2C marketing, data science frameworks, how to guides, and everything under marketing science and analytics. I have loved reading all of your posts, Sundar, really. And Sundar started as an analyst at Uber, and he was probably one of the first few analysts who worked on the rider team, as I understand. So very focused on B2C. At which point there were not many people working in this area, and then from there he has sort of grown into the marketing data science leader that he is now. He's advised a few companies and now writes and shares his thoughts via podcast, hopefully soon. But Sundar, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, Karan, thanks for having me. And you're right. You are one of the few people that has been able to get my name right. So I appreciate that. Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Of course, and great to have you. Honestly, I think after reading your post, I have so many topics that I want to speak to you about. But I would love for just to for you to introduce what you have done, like in your own words, and like what have you been speaking about, writing about, and how did you get here?
Yeah. So, an interesting thing that many people don't know is I started my career as a software developer. And the story of how I became a software developer is interesting, and I don't want to go into it too much, but I actually went to school for finance.
Okay.
I graduated in 2009, which is a terrible year to graduate into finance. And so a company called Bloomberg, very small, you might have heard of it, was interviewing on our campus for software developers who knew finance but didn't know how to code. And they actually hired me and then taught me how to program for the first 4 months of the job. So I was getting paid to learn how to program. It was pretty great. I did it for 2 years. I didn't love being a programmer. Then I went back into finance and I actually went to the US Treasury, which is another fun story that I've written about. But kind of found myself looking at my manager and I was like, I don't want to do your job either. So then I had another pivot where I had a friend who said, hey, we're looking for someone analytical. Do you know any? And I said, well, I'm analytical. You have to teach me the business context. This was a digital marketing analytics role. Digital marketing analytics was super hot at the time. And I was like, this is a very rare opportunity to pivot. And so I took that and then I haven't looked back. So I've been in marketing analytics and data science ever since. So after that role at DirecTV, I was a contractor for 10 months and then I went to Uber for 5 years. And that's the biggest chunk of my career and what I'm always most excited to talk about. Did a few Dutch startups, didn't work out really too well. Started consulting, advising. Most recently, I've decided to end that as well and go all in on just writing about B2C marketing and B2C data science. And that's kind of where I'm at. So I've got a newsletter and a podcast.
Yeah, you say just writing, but I have to say, right, and I was just telling you this before we started recording that reading your stuff was one of the rarest blogs where there was no fluff and I could relate to it so well. I'll definitely share some of my top 3 articles because I have a list. But yeah, man, like what I would love to know is also like tell me about your time at Uber because I know, as you said, right, like that's been the major chunk of your experience that you also draw from for your articles. So I remember like one line that you said in one of your articles was the tech was good, the mission was better, the people were the best. And I think this is from your like 8 marketing lessons.
Mhm.
So tell me what Uber taught you, like from a culture standpoint, from everything also from an analytics point of view, right? Like
Yeah.
from what do people get wrong? What was Uber doing well? What did you learn there?
Yeah. Oh, whew. We could do a whole episode just on this. So I think first off, right, you never realize how good of a place you're in until you leave it.
Andy Bernard
And
reference, by the way, Office. I
yes,
remember.
great
Yeah.
reference. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But specifically to that, right? Like I didn't realize I was at one of the best companies, data-driven companies in the world. And specifically like what they did so well and that I think everybody gets wrong in experimentation is you're meant to fail. Like that's actually the best byproduct you can get from experimentation because even though there's more you can think about from like sub-segmentation analysis and the data science side, that's less important. What it does is it creates a culture where it's acceptable to fail. And that's where Uber got it right. And that's the biggest thing that I learned, right? We, like I said, incredible tooling. So we had the best data scientists and data engineers in the world. We could build incredible tool, incredible product. The mission was amazing. Product, when you're on a rocket ship that has product market fit, so many issues get thrown away and it's easy to enjoy it. But the people, what I specifically mean is I was a junior analyst, at times that could have conversations with the highest level of the company because I found a data set and I found some insights and I was taught how to package it and communicate and deliver. And so I was taught to have conversations at the highest level. And that is something that I think many companies, they don't have that culture of safety, specifically psychological safety, that allow people to do that. And so that's what I've learned is if you want to be a data driven company, or even more specifically, I think people should be try to be data obsessed. You have to be a company where people feel safe to speak their thoughts, go deep dive and be independent and find insights. And that at the end of the day is the crux of it, and where I think experimentation, even to this day, fails.
I think that's a good point, and I'd love to like know a little bit more because recently I was working with a client, and I mean, no one wants to be in this space, right? Where I mean, everyone sort of, I think, when they hear that, they think, yeah, of course, that sounds great, right? Um, what happens is usually in practice, somehow we deviate and we land in a position where it suddenly becomes unsafe, or, it suddenly becomes like this place where you're getting things wrong very frequently, and then people start demanding that you do some things right.
Mhm.
And that just creates like this whole fear of, oh, I need to get this right, right? How do you how do you think, maybe from Uber or from your own personal experiences as well, like how do you feel companies can move to a position where you have this psychological safety? Have you been,
Mhm.
because you mentioned, for example, you were asked to provide insights to the highest level. Of course, you might have already shown insights that were interesting to people at that level, right? So how do you suggest people or companies move, and what have you seen work best when you want to move away from this culture of fear and more towards like sort of an open culture?
Yeah. So it's an easy answer and incredibly hard to execute. And the answer is it has to start with leadership. So Travis Kalanick is a very polarizing leader of Uber. He's been in the news countless times. People either hate him or love him, but you'll be surprised how many people within Uber absolutely love him. And what he did was again create this culture where you had to know your numbers. You could not come and BS him. But he would then take that and make decisions off it in a what felt like a non-biased way. You know, he maybe played favorites, but because those people were so good at continuously producing good insights, but not favorites from like a personality perspective. And so it's easy in that if your CEO understands this, then it's easy for it to permeate. The problem is how often those CEOs are so convinced that they are right. And you see this a lot in marketing. For some reason, every founder thinks they're a marketer. And there's so many nuances. And so the way you change it is the founder has to surround themselves with people that they're willing to trust and delegate, and those executives have to then do the same thing with the next level of management and so on. So it comes down to ego
Yeah.
and giving people access to data, right? So if you combine those things, if you remove ego and you give a transparent way for people to pull data without hiding, you create this magic effect where people then naturally go and chase insights and present it, and things get better quicker too. So there's no better way. I've never seen it if it doesn't start with the leadership, because there's a lot of investments, from the type of people you hire to the data set to tooling. Like it requires a full buy-in from the leadership.
Yeah. And I think like also bringing it to the level of life cycle teams, right? I can add some commentary there, right? Like for example, I remember in this job that I was talking about, we had this culture where, because life cycle teams, experimentation as product teams is a completely different ball game, I feel, because the returns are much higher, right? Like you are improving retention, you're improving conversions, you're affecting the bottom line very quickly with like some of these tests. So I think generally the tolerance towards bad or like towards mistakes or towards getting something wrong is okay. Whereas with life cycle, I feel like what you're working on at a business level is not such big impact, right? It's an enhancer at the end of the day for most of the companies, let's say. And I think like what happens then is when you're not moving the numbers in such a big way, but the tooling and the team and everyone is working a lot on it, it becomes hard to justify failing in tests, right? And I think what you said before was something that I completely relate to life cycle marketing, which is competence build trust, right? Like, so as a life cycle leader, I need to be sure that my team is bringing up the right numbers. They have like the data that they are bringing up is checked. I can't tell you how many teams I've been a part of who still don't know how to calculate stat sig on a test, right? And I think as a life cycle team, we are quite, I don't know if this is just like a selection bias because I probably work with companies who are struggling with life cycle. So maybe I see the worst of it or something like that. But I do think that we are as a niche need to really pick up on like sort of statistical literacy, and then if you reach a point where we can trust the data, I think it becomes a lot easier to have this culture where you say, okay, we failed, but you know the numbers, you know what we learned out of it. Most teams are not at that level, right? Like most teams still don't know why they are testing something and what did we learn out of it. Just having that framework usually helps.
Yeah, and just to add to that though, I think it's because you often have what I see as like immature data science teams, right? Because if you have a strong data science leader that can educate the lifecycle team and can say everything from let's set up a universal control group, here's how we can start to validate. A better example is how do we then bring data science to make your open rates, your click rates better, right? How do you deliver more personalized algorithms? And they don't have to be complex.
Hmm.
That's where it falls because data scientists are so often used to being told what to do, but the lifecycle teams have to know the potential of the data science teams and all the avenues you can explore, right? So it's two sides to that that often lead to a life cycle team that feels like it's underperforming.
Hmm. I see. I see what you mean. And tell me a little bit about your experience working with lifecycle teams. I know the video that got me to you, and I think like I'm super glad for that video. I don't know why, honestly, it has like I remember looking at the views of that video, and there were like hundreds of them. And then I was like, man, this is probably one of the best videos I've seen on segmentation. And I really wish this was like the most viewed video from a life cycle perspective, at least.
Can you
But
share it
you,
after? I don't even know where it is.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
I'll share it with you. I have it
oh
in front
man.
of me.
That's so funny.
No, I'll share it with you. And I think like in that video, you talk about like life cycle marketing and funnel optimization strategies. And just talk to me about your experience working with life cycle teams or team at Uber, and like how did that, what were the queries, right? Like that brought your attention to that team.
Mhm.
What were the kind of questions you were getting from them? And maybe we start there.
Yeah, so I had two different experiences. One, when I started, I was on the local rider operations team. I think you mentioned it in the intro, but Uber is a marketplace. There was a lot of people that were looking at the driver side, and they were called driver operations. And I was one of the earlier rider operations people looking at the demand side. It's not something that Uber had to think about too much early on because it's such good product market fit, but over time, you obviously have to consider that. So that was my first stint. And there I was really involved with how do I, get more riders in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area of the US to ride more. We were also deploying promotions for competitive strategic reasons. And so a lot of it was how do we, get better, get more use cases in the areas that we want them to for the type of products. What is the incremental effect of these promotions? How do we respond against competitive behavior? So really working with the marketing and pricing team there. Then I got moved to a global team. Sorry, no, it was a US based regional team, but there again it's working on life cycle at a more holistic level. So that's when we started to centralize and realize we don't have to duplicate efforts. Let's start to centralize marketing. Let's build a global lifecycle marketing team. And I'll get into a bit of what types of questions we answered. And then finally, at the end, I also did a lot of international stuff as well. So, how do you then scale these frameworks to an international structure? And the types of queries I got, right at the end of the day, this is what I think Uber also excelled. Like, people knew you had to drive higher open rates, higher click rates, but it was in service of more revenue or profit. So the questions were always, hey, what type of users are we not communicating with? What communications are working? Where do we see potential to add data science to get more robust targeting?
Hmm.
All of the questions you would want a data driven lifecycle marketing team to ask. I know it's a little bit of a vague answer, but it really was in that ballpark. And then the cool thing, this is the strategic side. Then after an analysis, after a campaign ran, a lot of questions around, okay, well, was there a day of week, a time of day where that worked better? Is there a subsegment of this population that worked better? What should our experimentation roadmap look like? And that's the key question, right? Is when you're doing a campaign, because like you've mentioned, so many times it fails. Well, you have to then take the step of like, well, some part of it had to have succeeded, or did all of it fail? If all of it failed, that's also a learning. That's a good thing to know. But that curiosity of, okay, well, what happened in more detail for more specific groups then triggers a natural roadmap. And you kind of think about it like you've got one experiment that'll open up three experiments, which will open up three more. And it becomes this like, I would call it a hydra, where all of a sudden you have a list of 20 experiments just because you've only run a few. And so you don't have to think about a roadmap too much when you've got this curiosity of, okay, well, what part of this worked? Well, okay, how do we double click on that one part? How do we get this one part to work better?
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And maybe we go into a bit more detail on that, right? For example, what I would love to know from you is when you started looking or working with the lifecycle team, how did you understand what was going on with lifecycle, right? Because I think, eh, as lifecycle marketer myself, it's sometimes very, I take it for granted what I know
Mm-hmm.
and what we can do as a team. And so what happens then is whenever I'm working with different teams like product or data teams, I'm often surprised at how much they knew about lifecycle, and how much, like, for most of the people that I speak to in different teams still think that lifecycle is a tool that sends out like sort of stuff in a silo, but that's changing very quickly. But yeah, how did you, when you sort of started your interaction with lifecycle team as a data scientist, how did you wrap your head around what lifecycle means and what does it comprise of?
Yeah. So you touch on a very important point, which is the biggest gap, I think, for lifecycle teams to succeed is lifecycle is not a marketing term. It's not meant to be. And it actually, you're defining a person's life cycle by their interaction with your product. It's actually a product definition. And yet all of a sudden we've been pigeonholed into thinking it's a marketing thing. So it first started with, unfortunately, there was no product definition, but marketing had defined what they thought was life cycle. So it was easier for me to understand where a person was because we had all these life cycles defined, and they're very straightforward. Have you signed up and not taken a trip yet? Okay. Well, has it been 7 days since you signed up? Well, then you're a different type of person, right? You're a person that had this intent to sign up. It's been 7 days. You haven't taken a first trip. So we're going to call you, let's call it life cycle sign up, no first trip. Well, now it's been 30 days, right? So our window of getting you to convert is really rapidly diminishing. So anyone after 30 days, will call it life cycle, sign up, no first trip, hard to reach. Simple. And now you've got a very concrete definition that everyone in life cycle can use to move the needle. But from a data scientist perspective, you can build very straightforward dashboards. How many people are in this life cycle? I bet you if you ask companies right now and I gave them a life cycle framework and I said, well, how many people haven't taken a first trip or a first transaction? I bet you 95% would not know, right? So it started with having these definitions already there. and then getting smarter about them. And for example, churn has a very simple definition early on, but then it should get more personalized, it should get more nuanced, it should get more robust. And so you evolve this over time, but it started with this idea of you have to have life cycle definitions. And yeah, that was the easiest way for me to understand life cycles, is because we had one, and then they were very intuitive, they were very easy to use. And so I've grown accustomed to that being the default. And so every time I hear companies don't have that, I'm like, it's so easy. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
easy to set up.
See, that's why I was asking you, because I think we often also overcomplicate it
Mhm.
ourselves, right? Like I think you have an article on like how Uber segments their life cycle, which as I was reading through that, I was like, actually, I don't know why anyone else would complicate it much more than this, right? Like this
Mhm.
sort of covers everything. It, and I think you also have to look at effort versus gain, right? And I feel like at that level of segmentation, you will get all the impact from life cycle that there is. So sometimes it's not even worth going a bit deeper than that, right? Um, but yeah, how did you? Maybe we go into that. I mean, I have read that article and I loved that article, but I would love to know. Maybe we take up some points there, right? Like I read, I think you mentioned there things about personalization, right? What is your like what were your experiences working with the lifecycle team on
Mhm.
personalization efforts? What did they look like? What were you mainly looking at?
Yeah. So first off, I think you brought up a really great point about just effort versus impact, and that's a common thing that I think product is really good at estimating. Marketing, maybe not so much. And so the first part is the first interaction with lifecycle is like, is this even worth doing personalization, right? So if you've got 2% of your riders are black car riders versus Uber X riders, then why even bother going down the route of Uber Black personalization in the beginning, right? Unless you feel like you've tapped out 98% of the gains from Uber X, just from a volume basis and impact basis, you kind of have to think about where you want to maximize your efforts. And so for me, personalization also, then the next step is we assume personalization has to be on this individual level, and by definition that's what it is. But people aren't that fundamentally different from each other. At the end of the day, a person that is taking Uber X Monday to Friday at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. is very clearly a business person taking Uber X to their business. Why does it need to be more than like, oh, they're going to a government place of work versus a
Hmm.
private versus a bank? And you could get that personal, right? You could say a person going to a bank is going to have higher willingness to pay um, than someone working for the government. But like, have you already covered the fact that they're business users? Have you already covered the fact that they only ride 9 to 5 and there's more adjacent use cases? Like, for example, hey, ride 9 to 5 2 times a week and get a free Uber for your weekend. Right? The whole goal of personalization and marketing is also to shift people across different use cases, right? That is what cross-selling is. So you want people to do more of the same, and you want them to do more different things, right? So cross sell, upsell. Those are the two axes that we should be thinking about. So personalization, at a high level is about, I think, finding clusters of people to make your work same effort but higher impact. That's what personalization does to me. So I could send out one email to 100 million writers, or I could send one email to 10 million writers that is slightly more personalized. And that one email to 10 million should actually outperform the one email to 100 million because I'm more personalized. And so personalization to me is really a way to keep effort the same but increase impact.
Hmm.
Or you could argue the other way, which is keep impact the same but then reduce effort. Those are the two reasons you personalize. Otherwise, if you're making your effort more complicated and it's not giving you more impact, then just stop doing it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that's what a lot of the struggle is, I think, within life cycle teams sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
because you keep hearing the benefits of personalization and personalization at scale. And then I think but you often forget the big picture, which is exactly what you said, right? Like you need to be focused on effort versus impact. And I think if you're making progress on either of the two, then you're good, right? Like you are, that's worth doing then.
Yeah, and maybe another point there is, again, you have these tools like a Braze who tout personalization with AI. A simple example: if I send a crappy email to one person at 9 a.m. versus 3 p.m. to another person, the benefits of that are far less than let me just A/B test a really good to get to a better email,
Hmm.
right? Like, personalize when you feel your product is, I mean, your email and your lifecycle campaigns are at least 80, 85% best in class. Until you get there, to get from 85 to 99%, that takes a lot of effort, a lot of optimization, a lot of personalization. But the first 85%, you can get to with like better subject line testing, better, and just at an aggregate level. Or are you even testing the right comms, right? Test your overall strategy. On one email, I send a price type email, the other one's a value, the other one is more of brand building. Test out the strategy first before you get into personalization. It's the same issue with every part of optimization. You see it across conversion rate optimization, you see it across marketing optimization. You're trying to optimize crap. It's not worth it. Just do the basic good work to get it to a much better place and then optimize.
There's definitely like this point about ROI that I want to get to at some point, because yeah, I have read some really good stuff that you've put out there about ROI and how it's a strategic choice sometimes on even calculating that. But just before we get there, right? Like also within personalization and segmentation, what are the kind of things that you saw that, let's say, delivered the highest impact, or like were a huge leverage when it came to impact or effort, right? Like what have you seen, just to get some ideas on like what that would look like?
Yeah. So an example I'll point to is, it's March 2020. COVID hits, our Uber rides business plummets by like 85, 90%. Then you come around the next year, and it takes about anywhere from 6 to 8 months for things to opening up. Governments are shifting all throughout Europe and the world, and you start to see signs of coming back. In a day, maybe 2 days, my team builds a personalization framework for every rider at Uber that we then share with their operations teams, marketing teams, product teams, so that they can leverage their own strategies to win back these riders. All the segmentation was every person had 5 attributes assigned to them. Are most of your trips to and from an airport? Are most of your trips, what product did you take? What time of day did you usually ride? What day of week? And then I forget the fifth attribute. With that, and this framework, then in like a month after, in front of 30,000 people, gets referred to, and it says, hey, we're winning back riders, airport riders, more than we're winning these other type of riders. Actually, maybe in the opposite case, airports are still down. But anyway, point being, in 2 days, I could my team set up a framework that segmented the entire 100 million plus population of Uber. But these attributes are fairly simple. That's all you have to know. Do they go to the airport a lot? Then they're probably not riding a lot now. Okay. Well, if they weren't riding to the airport, where did they use most of the use cases? Oh, they use it for nights and weekends. Not great. Bars and stuff are not open. Okay, they predominantly take Uber Black, Uber X. Can we convert them and say, the Uber, a good example, Uber pool rider, we could upsell and say, hey, take Uber X. It's more safe. You're not
Hmm.
sharing it with anybody. Right? Introduce a new feature. Introduce a new use case. Very simple. I'm talking to you like, we could get into a room and hash out the strategy on this in an hour. And so that's a good example of personalization that maximizes effort and impact, but doesn't go down to an individual level, because I'm not sending individual comms. I'm not sending an email just to Karen. I'm sending an email to anyone that used to mainly take airport trips and saying, hey, we know airports are still locked down. Have you thought about this other use case? We're enhancing our safety features. Same thing on the driver side. This is just a rider side segmentation. On the driver side, you could also do something similar. there's people who make a living and their livelihood off of Uber. And so you need to inform people that are riding full time versus part time versus on all very differently. But same type of use case. How many hours a week do you ride or do you drive? Sorry. When do you usually drive? How long have you been on the platform? Right. You want to generally retain older cohorts. And
Hmm.
so simple
Yeah.
3 attributes. And so that's where I've seen personalization really excel, is when you force yourself to limit yourself to constraints. Hey, we need a personalization framework in 2 days, or you've got this budget, or we can only send X number of emails. How do we personalize it better? So if you force yourself into this like scarcity mentality, I find across most things it has better results.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think like I remember reading, I think Amplitude has a very good playbook on personalization. And there they mentioned that how you have like the spectrum of personalization is, one to many, one to few, and one to one. And I think as you go down that route, you have this peak on one to few. So one to
Mm,
many is not the most optimal, but in most cases, one to one is also not the most optimal
mm,
because of exactly the effort versus impact. So you kind of peak at one to few, which is what you are suggesting as well, right? Like you have the use case based segmentation, and that's usually enough to get 80% of the gains, right? And I think
mm.
like yeah, I feel like that's been my experience as well so far.
Yeah, and personalization, just one more point, like it also depends on the outcome and the levers that you can pull. So for example, if you're retail, personalization is everything because a person is buying an individual product. And so you have diverse supply and you need to surface the right product for them. If you take a use case like Uber, we only have 3, 4 products in a city. So, and first off, we can't change the price per person, right? There's laws around that. And so when you can't flex price, so you can't personalize, like you can personalize discounts, but you can't personalize price. And you can't also personalize product. We only have 4 products. You're sort of constrained to what are the types of personalizations that you can do. A good example is for you, UberX might be the first thing that you see on your app. For me, it might be Uber Black just based on my behavior.
Hmm.
After that, there's not too much personalization I can do for rides. Even as I think about it, I can maybe do better suggestions of like, oh, are you going home? But like, I mean, that's like, I'm not gonna say it's 10 minutes of work, but it's 10 minutes of thinking,
Yeah.
right? It's not, personalization doesn't have to be that hard. Your personalization has to be equivalent to the outcome it's going to drive.
100%. Have you experimented? And this is more of a personal question because I'm doing this right now, or I'm in the middle of doing this for a client right now. So I'm getting some free consulting from you. But for example, what we've been wondering is, I work with a lot of subscription apps, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then I think we were having this discussion, and what we found is personalization on how much promotions or how much discount we offer is probably one of the biggest leverage we have for this app and for the new users of this app. And we have a lot of flexibility there, so we can actually do whatever we want, right? Have you had any experience with that, like, and if not, like, how would you think about it, right? Some initial thoughts that we had was, of course, base it on usage. So if you come in and if you're highly motivated, maybe we can convert you at a lower rate and lower discount. And then, you have people who download the app but do not start using it, but have complete intention to, and those people probably would be nudged with a higher discount. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the level of our thinking so far. But how would you think spontaneously about that?
Yeah. Oh, fun. This is like a live whiteboarding session, which is really cool. I think more people should do that on podcasts. So I first start by saying it has to be rooted in an outcome based metric like revenue or LTV. So right. So one of the things that is hard to, not hard, but sometimes is often forgotten, is there's a cost per incremental conversion. Does that outweigh the cost per, I mean, the benefit per incremental conversion, right? So for even in your example, one of the things I would think about is, what is the data that we're collecting? Are we collecting things about use case, motivation, why they're entering the app? Are we collecting in personalization? Personalization, for example, by marketing channel. It's probably an even bigger lever than by use case, right? If the channel that you came in was maybe affiliates versus a paid ad versus organic, that's a very different funnel that you should be shown and personalized for. I would think about those high use case levers higher up. And again, going back to, let's get into the head of the customer. They are coming through a certain channel for a certain reason. They're coming for, yeah, again, a certain reason. Can we extract and personalize based on those two levers? Everything after that then tends to normalize, right? Why they're using the product, how often, it probably has a little bit more consistency. But those two things, how they heard about you, why they're there, are the two biggest things that you can play around with. And that's where I would think about pricing. The other thing you want to do is look at historically and say, by channel, by motivation, if you have that information, what are those LTV? So it's about personalizing, not personalizing, it's about segmenting correctly.
Mm,
Personalization, again, goes hand in hand with segmentation. And segmentation at the end of the day is to identify highest value users, right? So you should be doing less for low value users and do more for high value users. And so even as you're pricing, you have to have an understanding of what a low value user looks like and what a high value user looks like. And so that's where, segmentation comes in first, and then you're delivering a personalized experience to that segment.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think like for lifecycle teams also, I think like accessibility to data sometimes
Mm-hmm.
at companies is a very big criteria, right? Like sure, sometimes you have marketing channel data which is not available. I can't tell you how often I have onboarding data that a product collects that is not piped into the CRM tool. So I think there's like this huge component of accessibility to tools or to data, to clean data, which plays a big role, in especially life cycle. But cool, man. I think that's a lot about personalization and segmentation, probably more than I initially thought. We spoke about a few things, right? And the next point on my notepad was actually to talk to you about measurement and A/B testing, because I think you mentioned that it is the gold standard of testing. Any inputs there, right? Like one specific thing that I want to ask is, why is it so difficult for marketing teams to get that? And why do you think there still needs to be, because if you Google A/B testing, right, like you get a certain, I think what you get is what you need to do really. Like there's not much, it's not very complicated to do, right? Like it's fairly easy to understand. Doesn't that translate to action? Like what do teams typically get wrong? What is happening? Why are we not doing it well?
Yeah, so I think this pattern for experimentation, for why people like, also applies to most things that are simple in nature that we just tend to overcomplicate. Um, like experimentation, let's start, like, let's ignore the statistics for a while. There's a bit of like, you need good sample sizing, you need like a good randomizer, you need a good like data pipeline to be able to track it, and then the calculator to calculate stat sig is relatively straightforward. The biggest blocker for experimentation starts way before, and it starts with this idea of, I know what I'm doing, so we don't have to test it, which really is a root insecurity of, I'm too scared to be proven wrong.
Hmm.
And so again, experimentation is a human practice. And so with it, you get all of the issues of being human, right? You've got people that are ego, you've got pressure from people above saying we've got to move fast, we've got to ship fast. You've got people, that just don't want to be proven wrong and don't know how to handle that. And that's really the big, like, if you can overcome those barriers, there's not much stopping teams from experimenting, right? The tooling is that's a resource thing, that's an issue. So again, it goes to the top. Like if you've got people that go, yeah, experimentation is good, I'll pay for whatever tool. You got tooling solved. You can even hire just one data scientist, and that's good enough. So it comes down to like, why don't people experiment? Because they don't want to know what's on the other side of that experiment. And a good example is, I had this client. I went to the lifecycle team and they were sending 7 emails a week, one a day, a daily blast. And I was like, why? Like, why are you doing this? And like, this is how we've always done it. And I said, okay. why don't we do an ABC test? 33% of the group will get 0, 33% will get 4 emails a week, and 33 will get 7 emails a week. Let's just see what happens. In one test, we proved email was incremental because both the 4 and the 7 outperformed the 0. But we proved that the 7 was not more incremental than the 4. Actually, it had higher unsubscribes, same revenue. In now one test, I've proven that your team is incremental, and I've proven that you can do like 45% less work by going from four emails from 7. But why did they have to do 7 emails? Because the founder said that's what the competitors were doing. And that went on for years
Yeah.
before I was able to, step in and help the team with that test, right? So the experimentation, they had all the tools. It's not like I came in and installed a new tool or a new data science. They had the data science team, they had the tool, they had the strategy. They just didn't have the buy-in. That story is probably representative of
Yeah.
80% of why experimentation doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I completely relate to it. I remember working with a client who used to have this number where they were like, okay, every week we need to send one, I think it was like around 50 or 100 million push notifications. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a large company, and they were like, okay, we need to send these many notifications. So the team, what they used to do is by Friday morning, they used to measure how many they send out. And then how many ever were left, they would send like this blast campaign out because, and this was going on for years. Like, and exactly to your point, like I think the founder or someone super senior in the team who didn't have time to look at life cycle just thought, okay, whenever we send more, we see more. So I don't have the time to go into the depth of life cycle and what they're sending out. I just need to hit the number. And so they gave this guideline until someone decides to look at it. But then that was taken as the golden rule. Everyone thought that this person had thought really hard about this, but it was not even like it was just a message on Slack a few years ago, and that's why people were doing what they were doing. But I totally agree with you. I think like honestly, even more recently, I would say that tooling is the least of the problems, right? Like the tooling is become so good. You have, of course, tools like Braze. You have some new tools that are coming up that allows you to also test different copies, and with the AI doing that, like or having machine learning optimize for copies that are working well versus not, things like that, right? So those are definitely and the key things, right? And I feel like there was this one really good article from, I think it was from Ravi Mehta. I love this guy, by the way, and I'm a huge Reforge fan. I remember this article like years ago when I was starting out, and what he said is experimentation is a very good tool to stay humble, right? Like you experiment stuff because you want to prove yourself wrong every time, and to assume that you know what a user is going through is almost always wrong, right? Like, so I think just keep proving yourself wrong. And I think the other thing that we also get wrong as lifecycle teams sometimes is also not focusing on learning. So I feel sometimes what statistics you need, what you really need to get out of an experiment, but you haven't had a learning plan, right? Like you don't know what you will do after the experiment is successful. And I think that's like that sort of thinking beforehand always goes a long way. Cool, man. And I think the other topic, anything to add, by the way, on A/B testing or anything that you feel you want to impart to life cycle marketers on A/B testing?
What I'll say for lifecycle marketers on average is don't be scared by the statistics, right? Like you don't need to take an entire course of statistics to understand like A/B testing. Just take like the first day. Like mean, median, standard deviation is pretty much representative of confidence intervals. Or you need to know like 4 terms for A/B testing. And so, part of it has to be a curiosity from the lifecycle marketer, and on the flip side, there has to be curiosity from the data scientist to want to either help educate or help push the business forward. Like the trap that most data scientists fall into is like, well, I just want to do the data science part. Again, there is no such thing as the data science part. The entire job is to make the business better. just through data science. Like there's no job spec where it says, hey, you just have to show up and code. No, the job spec says make our business better. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I'll add. I'm very passionate about and very frustrated often.
I completely feel you. I think you wrote somewhere marketing science is the fun job of trying to prove and improve the ROI of marketing campaigns. Our sole reason for existence is for CMOs to come up with elaborate campaigns and tell us in the 11th hour that they want statistically accurate ROI calculations so that they can look good to the CEO. I think I highlighted that because I feel like that is unfortunately that's how it happens in most companies still. And yeah, it can get a bit frustrating.
Yeah.
What about like measurement? Honestly, there's just this one thing that you wrote which was super interesting to me on measurement is how two things actually. So one is around the point of how measurement sometimes is a strategic choice. Like you don't need to measure everything as long as you have that the right intuition, and if it makes business sense to do something, you should still go ahead with it. I would love for you to expand on that a little bit. I don't know if you've had the chance to put it in sort of life cycle context, but
Mhm.
what do you mean there? Yeah, maybe let's start there and then I can
Yeah.
ask you.
I would amend it a little bit to it's not don't measure because you have good intuition. That's actually the biggest trap you can fall into. You like measurement is a strategic choice. And so if you decide not to measure, understand the consequences of not measuring, right? We've all experienced it where, hey, we didn't set up an A B test or we didn't set up a test plan. And then a week later it's like, oh man, I really need to understand the ROI. Well, tough. I'm not going to go do, and this is something you only develop as you become more senior and become more comfortable. But I would often, in very, very nice terms say tough.
Hmm.
We can't measure it. We're not going to measure. What we can learn from this is let's have a test plan for the next time. And I'm very strong advocate of like, I've got a 2.5 year old and there's only so many times you can tell them don't do that, don't do that. And then sometimes you have to let them fall and you go, okay, well, that's why we tell you not to do that. Right. And it's kind of the same thing with, I'm not saying marketers are 2.5 year olds, by the way. That's not the intended analogy. But the point is like sometimes with measurement, like you have to make a strategic choice. And the best example I can give is, we ran a Super Bowl ad for Uber. There's no way to measure that, right? I had to go through so many hoops to prove in the minute after the campaign launched, our share of search went up. In the minute after the campaign launched, we saw more requests than we expected. Great. All of which are good, but did you really spend $5 million for like a 10-second bump? Like, no,
Hmm.
you spent it because you wanted to build a brand awareness over the entire year. Well, how do I measure that? I can't. So measurement is a strategy. And on to your question of when do you not need to, there's really great use cases of just hygiene emails, right? Transaction emails. No one is ever saying, hey, let's A B test that order receipt.
Hmm.
And if they are, then I'm sorry as a lifecycle marketing team that you have to do that because there's some basic intuition stuff like that. So it's picking and choosing, saying, listen, let's just copy paste what a competitor does. This receipt email is good enough. What's not good enough is all of the brand campaigns we're doing. Well, let's go optimize that. So it's placing your chips in places where the bets actually matter versus a relatively standard thing like receipt transaction emails. I don't know. I don't feel like you have to A/B test that.
Yeah, 100% not. Please, anyone listening, please don't. And if you are asked to, please get out of that that team. I think like that's. I have never been asked that, so I hope no one's doing that. To be honest,
Yeah.
no. But there are definitely like hygiene touch points that you also do as part of, for example, newsletter campaigns that keep people up to date about, about whatever the brand has to say that helps them. And sometimes you see that there's no clear ROI attached to it. Like you don't get more orders because of it. You don't get more engagement necessarily out of it right away. But I think you start taking that place in a user's life where they are hearing from you and they trust you for that data. And at some point that comes back in forms that you can't really measure, right? And I think that's, at least for life cycle, I feel like those are some of the key things that we tend to overcomplicate sometimes.
Yeah, I would also push back that you can't measure it. I think you can. You just have to have a certain level of conviction, setup, and sort of sacrifice that you're willing to do that, to measure. It's the same thing with brand, a larger brand like TV, out of home. Like you can measure those. You just have to be willing to not set up a TV campaign for 50% of your audience, right? There's ways to measure things, and so I spent a lot of my career basically knocking down these silos, saying you can measure this. Let's choose when we do, when we don't. If you do want to measure it, there's a right way to measure and there's a wrong way. And so it's finding that balance of how and when do you measure, that is the challenge.
Yeah, yeah. As you say, right? It's a strategic decision
Mhm.
to also choose what do you want to mention. Super nice. I think the other article, I think it was an article, was around health metrics, which I loved, by the way. I think you were talking about like how North Star metric is what you want to optimize for a business and what sort of indicates, good things for your business. But then a health metric is what you need, on a weekly level, that you can sort of look at one metric and you know if things have gone down well or not. And it sort of gives you that uh, initial health check, right? And I think the
Mhm.
analogy that you were making there was how you have health metrics for your own body, right? Like you check your BMI, you check your heart rate, and everything is okay. Doesn't mean you are in perfect health, but it tells you more or less that you don't need to get checked for anything crazy, right?
Mhm.
Maybe expand a little bit on that, right? Like, and also, I don't know if you have done similar exercises for life cycle teams, but how would you think about that if you were sort of leading a life cycle team or helping?
Yeah, man, and so many good questions. I love it. So the idea of a health metric is, at a very quick glance, like you said, to just understand the health of your business. And the example that I used in that writing was percent of trips with surge for Uber. Very quickly, everyone knew that if it was less than 10%, that was too little surge. That means we had not enough demand. And if it was more than like 20-25%, it was too much demand. So you could instantly, with one metric, with no other intuition, just from a simple heuristic, tell you, is your marketplace healthy? If you take that then to a company, like what you want to under like what I outline is that for an e-commerce or direct to consumer business, what are the percentage of users that are adding to cart, right? What you want to understand is your marketing healthy, is your product mix healthy, and it doesn't have to be 100%. Obviously the higher the better, but maybe not, right? Because maybe if too many people are adding something to their cart, the price is way too low. It's like too good of a deal. So part of it is understanding what is that range for your health metric. Now for a life cycle team, you could argue open rate is a bit of the health metric. I mean, yeah, I think that's a good thing because it's also, I'm writing a newsletter and that's still how I quantify my health. If I write, if I look at best in class, it's above 20% is what you want your open rate to be, right? So if it's below that, really bad. But
Hmm.
mine is much higher, which means I'm probably attracting too niche of an audience. Like I need to expand a bit more to get like more growth, right? So I think about it from that, because at the end of the day, can't if you do something like revenue generated, it's a little too far downstream. Also, that's not always the goal of lifecycle marketing. So,
Hmm.
it can't be there. So, what is the thing that you can control? What's the lever that you can control? It's how good are your comms? How do you judge how good your comms are? It's by a mix of
Engagement.
open rate and unsubscribe rate, right? So, if you can get those two balanced where you have a decently high open rate and a decently low unsubscribe rate, that's a good balance. Yeah, that's how I would think about it. I tend not to, even in my examples, like tend not to go too far down the revenue stream. So like social networks should use percent of users that engage, and you can define engagement in whatever way you want. But that's how you know that the quality of supply created on your social network is good, while the percentage of people engaging in the demand side is good too, right? So again, you want to find this metric that represents your goal. That doesn't mean you should go optimize it. It's just a pulse check,
Hmm.
because otherwise you can get too hung up on optimizing an open rate and has no business impact, right? But it has to be this balance. That one's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked you is because when I was reading it, I have landed on a version that works for myself. Like whenever I'm working with a client, I have this thing where I feel like if I see that on a Monday, but it's not one number, it's like a bunch of maybe 20 numbers. But then if I see that, I know what to focus on and what to really dive deeper into for life cycle teams, right? And I feel like that it's such a complex combination of things. Like, I want to know by life cycle stage. I want to know, for example, open rates are good for people who are in the engagement zone, but
Mm,
then for activation and onboarding, what I'm really looking at is also sends, like if something broke from the
mm.
data side. So I still open rates, conversion rates, but in a mix of those. But I think that's why I just want to get your take on it. Cool, man. I think there actually, funnily, there are so many more topics that I have here that I wanted to speak to you about, but I know we are running out of time, and
Yeah.
probably people will not listen to it for an hour or more. So I'll spare you the rest of the questions for a later time, Sundar. But anything else that you'd like to add? How can people know more about you? Also, like, I know that you're launching a new podcast. What are you up to in 2025? And yeah, and how can people get more of your insights?
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I'll just have to come back and we chat some more on stuff.
100%.
But I think the two things that I'm working on, I've spent a lot of time understanding what gives me energy and what doesn't, and it really comes down to the content and sharing my experiences. So I'm just doing the newsletter and just doing a podcast, and I write a lot on LinkedIn. That's it. That's what I'm focusing on right now. The content is solely on B2C marketing and marketing data science. So really understanding, what 10 companies are doing, what the best B2Cs in the world are doing around marketing and marketing data science. But yeah, that's it. Just those two things
You
for
say
the rest of
just,
2025.
you say just, but honestly, I know how hard can it be
Yeah.
to write consistently and to produce the quality you do is amazing, to be honest. And yeah, and I'm so glad you could make it to this recording. I had so much fun discussing these with you, and hopefully we do a part two soon to
Yeah.
discuss more
Yeah.
things around process and stuff. But yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for
Yeah.
being here.
Thanks, Karan. Thanks so much for having me.